Hello, I am Brian Taylor. I am a principal engineer at Optimizely, and I'm excited to share with you today how at Optimizely we take great advantage of ScyllaDB's incredible concurrency. First, a little bit about me. I'm married. I have 3 very young children. In the course of my career, I've had the opportunity to create 2 programming languages and 2 databases for legitimate business reasons. I point that out because all of my computer science professors promised me no one ever does that. I'm very happy that they were wrong. That's a blast. The reason they were wrong in my case is the third point. I love finding some property in the solution space that if you can maintain it, everything gets simpler. That is the reason that one of those languages and one of those databases exist. So what we're going to talk about today is how much Scylla loves concurrency. And once I've driven that home and shown you kind of the boundaries of that love, I want to teach you how to find more concurrency in your problem. So let's talk about concurrency. As we talk through concurrency, I want you to hold this conceptual model in your head. So this is the life cycle of a write. A client makes a request via the driver and starts the clock named R. That request enters a queue, traverses the network, eventually arrives at Scylla, enters another queue. Eventually, Scylla picks it up and starts the timer S. It does some work, eventually commits that write to disk, and then it stops the timer S, drops the answer in another queue, the answer traverses the network, arrives at the client queue, the client picks it up, and actually gives the response back to your client, and that stops the timer R. Let's zoom out from that conceptual model, look at it more abstractly. Big idea to keep in your mind is R is about 10 times longer than S in time. So asking Scylla to do more work concurrently looks like the picture below, and the payoff is as we stack up concurrent requests, that round trip time that is making up a lot of R gets to parallelize. Even if Scylla executes S sequentially, it's kept busy more often, and in the limit, as concurrency approaches infinity, our theoretical effective average R time gets closer and closer to S. Remember, R is 10 times bigger than S, so that is awesome. Let's define some terms. First term, throughput. That is measured in number of things per second you're doing. This is probably the number you care most about in your application. Second definition, concurrency. This is the number of independent things that are happening at the same time. That is the tool that this talk is teaching you how to use to influence throughput. Service time, S, is how long ScyllaDB took to do a thing, and request time is how long it took to do that thing from the client's perspective. So from the previous mental model, R is S plus some round trip time. In a world where you only do one thing at a time, your client makes a request, waits for an answer to come back, the best throughput you can hope for is 1 over R. That's the pure sequential world. If you're willing to introduce concurrency into your solution, X becomes a lot more interesting, and we're going to talk about that more. But to set the stage to talk about that more, we need to talk about load testing. Classical load testing is what's called closed-loop load testing. The model of the world is we stand up some number of virtual users, they all make requests, they wait for the answer to come back, and when the answer comes back, they make another request. This is very common. This is the model that ScyllaBench uses. I claim it is not very useful for modern capacity planning, and I'm going to flesh out that argument over the next few slides. But it is very useful for applying a tool called the universal scaling law. So the universal scaling law was discovered by Dr. Neil Gunther. It's a generalization of Amdahl's law, and it says that any practical system, it predicts, will have a relationship between concurrency N and throughput X that looks like this plot. This plot is built from real measurements from a real small Scylla cluster. So the universal scaling law, the USL, predicts that there's a region of concurrency that gives you linear improvement in throughput. That's the left region. Eventually, any practical system will saturate some real component, and that is the saturation region, which is the middle part of the plot. And most realistic systems eventually reach a point where driving them with more concurrency actually hurts your throughput, and that is the retrograde region. Now again, this is the USL plotted against real ScyllaDB data. All right, so I claim the type of load testing you should be doing for capacity planning is open loop load testing. In contrast to closed loop testing, where you choose a number of users and they just make requests one after another as soon as the answer comes back, open loop load testing models the load as a constant throughput, meaning at all times it's just driving your system with 1,000 requests per second or something like that. In this world, concurrency is theoretically completely unbounded, but I claim this is more useful because you probably all have internet applications. Does anyone know how many users they have? I have no idea. Closed loop load testing made sense in a world where you were planning the size of a mainframe and all of the users you could have were in the room next door. That's not the world we live in. These two models are related. So closed loop load testing is choose concurrency. That is the x-axis of the plot you see on the right. Open loop load testing is choose x. That is the y-axis of the plot on the right. That distinction is interesting because the USL predicts that the performance of your system is a function of n, meaning there is one value for any n, but it is not a function of x. Notice that there are x's in this plot that have multiple valid values for n, and that is predicting some instability in your system if it is driven by a load that looks like an open loop load, which is what the internet is driving your system with. So let's do some open loop load testing. This is that same Scylla cluster that I showed you the USL plotted against, being driven with an open loop load generator at 4,000 operations per second, and then jumping up to 40,000 operations per second. What's really interesting about this picture you see is that S, the service time of Scylla, didn't change even though I increased throughput by a factor of 10. That's interesting. Also note that R, the request time experienced by the client, didn't change much, 1.5 milliseconds to 2.5 milliseconds, even though I increased throughput by a factor of 10. Note also that the band of concurrency is pretty tight. We're operating in the linear region of Scylla's scalability. The key property that makes this region linear is the fact that we still have excess SSD throughput available. So remember, under the hood, Scylla is prioritizing two workloads. One is the compaction workload that's constantly running in the background, keeping your data nice and tight. And the other is the flush workload in the foreground, committing your writes to disk. If there's idle space left as those two workloads are competing, the system is nice and stable. You're in the linear region. You should take full advantage of the linear region of scaling for Scylla in your design. Now let's talk about the saturation region. So the USL predicted that my cluster would saturate at 100,000 operations per second. This test is driving at 100,000 operations per second, and it got lucky. It actually is stable in this particular run. Notice, even though it's stable, S, according to Scylla, is increasing over time and is way bigger than what we observed in the linear region. Notice also that R is 10 times bigger what we saw in the linear region, and concurrency is covering a huge band. It's all over the map. This is exactly what the USL was predicting. Running up in the saturation region, there's now many valid values for concurrency. Performance will be everywhere. So engineer your system to stay out of saturation. That's very important. Now again, remember the mechanism for being in linear versus saturation is how much throughput is left in your SSD. So in saturation, now the SSD is pegged. Compaction and foreground flushing are consuming all of the available throughput. If either of those things shift around a little bit, it affects the other, and we have instability. For example, this is exactly the same test, just run again, and now we have instability. This is 100,000 records per second. This time, something perturbed the system. Maybe a compaction needed a little more throughput. S, the amount of time Scylla takes to do its work, jumped way off the map. It's now 1,000 times larger than it was when we were in the linear region performance. And R, Went from, remember, 1 to 2 milliseconds in the linear region. It's now 55.8 seconds. That's incredible. Concurrency has also shot way up. I actually artificially pegged it at 4096. The first time I ran this test and hit this instability, my test consumed all available memory, running more and more things concurrently, and crashed. So I had to force my system to stop scaling after 4096 concurrent operations. We have now entered the dreaded retrograde region. This is the place where, as we ask for more throughput by increasing our concurrency, we get less. So the more we push, the less we get. We're on the road to hell. If there is not some limiting mechanism in your system will consume all resources and fail, usually with an out of memory. Okay, what did we learn from all of that? First of all, Scylla has an awesome linear region. And if you can operate, if there is more capacity in that linear region and you have more work to do, you should do it. That is free throughput. Take full advantage of the linear region. It is awesome. Saturation is a very dangerous place, because if you're running at saturation, you're one small system perturbation from being in retrograde, which again is the road to hell. So stay out of saturation, stay in the linear region. So where are we going to get all of that concurrency from? Hopefully I've convinced you that Scylla can make great use of the concurrency within some boundaries, but where do you get it? There's a boring answer to that question, which is concurrency, just use threads. That's boring, but there is a nugget of value here. So there are cheap mechanisms for concurrency, and there are expensive mechanisms for concurrency. So for example, a Java thread costs about a megabyte of stack. Low hundreds of threads in Java are reasonable. They're cheaper in Go, but they're darn cheap if you use a reactor-style concurrency system like C* or Rust's Tokyo. In that regime, tens of thousands of things happening concurrently is perfectly reasonable and feasible. But that is the extent of the code answer being interesting to this question. A far more interesting answer to where does concurrency come from is data dependency. Data dependency is the relationship between a unit of work and the previous units of work. And data dependency is ultimately what completely decides what it's safe to do concurrently and what it's not safe to do concurrently. So the easy case is when you have no data concurrency or no data dependency. Classic example of that is a write-only workload where every write is to a different slot. In that world, you can do it as concurrently as you want to. It doesn't change the answer. A more challenging world is when you have partitionable concurrency. That means there's some aspect of the work you're trying to do where if you group certain things by, say, a key A and other things with a key B, it's safe to do things with key A and key B at the same time, but everything within A needs to be sequential and everything within B needs to be sequential. A much harder world to operate in, and what I want to dig into in this talk, is arbitrary happens before concurrency. And that's the world where you need to actually understand the operations themselves and find ways that you can be safely concurrent. Let's define some more terms. First, a command is an atomic unit of work. It's one thing your system's being asked to do. It contains IOPS. IOPS are work according to the database. It's a read or a write. A batch is a group of IOPS that it is safe to execute concurrently. A slot is a cubby for data. It's a place you put data. It has a name. In ScyllaDB, it's your partition key plus your clustering key. A concurrency strategy is correct if it groups IOPS into batches such that the final state of the system with respect to the slots is the same as what the system would have been if you executed all of the commands sequentially. So in the world where there's no data dependency, your concurrency strategy is a breeze. Doesn't matter what you do. Group your commands into batches however you want. So in this example, the line I drew between command 3 and command 4 to divide my batches was arbitrary. Could have put it anywhere and the final result would be correct. A more difficult world is where you're doing read, modify, write operations. This is a world where you need to read an old value from a slot, do something, and then write a value back either to that slot or to a different slot. This is the problem that most streaming platforms are solving when they use partition concurrency. In this world, again, we've got commands coming in. Each command has a partition. In this example, I'm using tenet as my partitioning key. There's two partitions, A and B, and I can execute commands that are coming from tenet B concurrently with commands coming from tenet A, but everything from tenet A needs to happen sequentially. If you want to do better than this, you need to start digging into the IOPS themselves. And to do that, we need to understand the golden rules of data dependency. And that is, a read from a slot must be able to observe all of the writes to that slot that happened before. And the second rule is that the final value of a slot must represent the last write to that slot. So if we apply those rules, remember the previous example I showed you with strict partition concurrency had 4 batches. We can get that down to 3. So if we apply the golden rules, we recognize that read A, read C, read D, those don't interact, they can be concurrent. They can happen at the same time. However, write B in the first command and write B in the second command need to sequence so that the final write B is the one that impacts the final state. We can take this even further though, because all of the golden rules imply simplification rules. So you've got the golden rule that reads must be able to observe any writes that came before them. We don't have to observe those reads from the database. We could, for example, synthesize those reads from the batch itself. The second golden rule says that the final value of a slot needs to represent the last write to that slot in the sequence. We don't have to write. We don't have to actually execute the writes before the last write. We could just skip those and still observe the final golden rule. So let's apply that rule to our problem. Note, now we've eliminated another batch because we've recognized we don't actually have to sequence those writes between command 1 and command 2 if we just delete the write and command 1, and that doesn't change the result. So that's really cool. We went from 4 batches to 2 batches with far more concurrency. What's the payoff? So I actually run in production 2 systems that use radically different concurrency models. The first one uses normal partition concurrency. It is a classic streaming platform. It's highly resourced, has 64 cores. Its maximum throughput is about 8,000 commands per second. And it has a flaw that torments us constantly that we call the data shape problem. But in reality, it's the fact that partition cardinality changes over time. If you get more partitioning, your partition key has more cardinality, at one point in time you have more concurrency. If it has less, you get less, and your throughput's a function of concurrency. The second system, much less resourced, 15 cores versus 64, and it uses happens before concurrency. It actually inspects the IOPS and understands how tightly it can pack things. It uses cheaper concurrency, reactor versus threads, and with those less resources, it can push a throughput of 30,000 records per second. What's awesome about this system, what I love the most, isn't the throughput, it's the fact it's not sensitive to partition key cardinality. So to drive that home, in a recent Black Friday, we discovered that cardinality can jump extremely high, and in fact, push us into the retrograde region. And now we have a new limiter that we didn't know we needed to keep us out of the retrograde region. Relying on partition keys is very scary. All right, so I hope you've learned something valuable from this talk, and I hope you stay in touch. There's lots of ways to get a hold of me. I'd love to chat with people. I hope you found this valuable. Have a great day.